Marcus Avery was 39 years old the night his wife told him he was the smallest decision she had ever made. He was still wearing his work boots when she said it. The ones he'd had resoled twice, because he'd never seen the point of replacing something that still had use left in it. He was sitting across from her at a round table in the kind of restaurant where the lighting is kept deliberately low, and Simone had dressed for the occasion in a way that told him, before she ever opened her mouth, that this was not a conversation. It was a ceremony. She slid a manila envelope across the white cloth between them, her wedding ring catching the candlelight one last time, and she said, loud enough for the couple beside them to go still, that she had finally found a man who understood what her life was supposed to look like. That man had a private jet. That man had a 6-bedroom estate in Ballantyne with a circular driveway and a wine cellar and a master suite that faced the Charlotte skyline. That man, she told Marcus, was not him, and never would be. The envelope held divorce papers, every page already flagged with yellow tabs. Marcus signed them without a word, every page, his hand steady as a level on fresh concrete. What Simone did not know, what she could not have known, because she had spent 9 years looking at her husband and seeing only what she decided to see, was that the private jet belonged to Avery Meridian Holdings. The mansion in Ballantyne sat on a deed inside a trust administered by that same company. And the man she was leaving him for, a man named Derek Hollis, had been a senior logistics director inside that company for 4 years, drawing a salary that Marcus Avery approved personally every January, without once putting his name on the letterhead. She had no idea she had just handed her future to a man who answered to the husband she was walking out on. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. It had been a Thursday in early October, the kind of Charlotte evening when the heat finally relents and the sky above Myers Park goes the color of copper, gone soft. Marcus had driven home from a distribution center inspection out past Harrisburg, still in the dark canvas jacket he wore on site visits, the kind of jacket Simone had once bought him for Christmas and had stopped mentioning years later when it became clear he intended to actually wear it. He remembered the drive home the way a man remembers the last quiet hour before a long illness, the way the October light lay across the neighborhood, the Bradford pears beginning to turn along Selwyn Avenue, the particular sound his truck made pulling into the driveway of the house on Hawthorne Lane that he had bought 12 years ago with a down payment he'd saved working double freight routes for 3 straight years. He'd built the front steps himself. Not because he had to, because he wanted something in that house that his own hands had shaped from the raw material, something that would hold weight long after the receipts faded. His mother, Cora May Avery, had watched him pour that concrete and told him, in the particular way she had of making plain things sound permanent, a man who builds his own steps never forgets what it took to get to the door. She was gone now, 4 years in the ground out in Concord, but her voice had a way of arriving exactly when he needed it. The house was quiet when he walked in. Simone was out. He'd grown used to that. In the early years of their marriage, her absence had felt like a gap in the room. Lately, it felt like weather he'd learned to dress for. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back deck he'd added in the 3rd year, the cedar planks he'd sealed himself each spring since. 9 years of that deck. It knew his weight better than most people did. He'd noticed things for months before he allowed himself to name them. The new perfume she wore only on evenings she didn't explain. The way her phone went screen down whenever she set it on the counter near him. A weekend conference in Raleigh that left no receipts, no hotel loyalty points, no particular stories when she returned. A logistics director named Derek Hollis, whose name had appeared in a company dinner photograph on a community board site, standing, a half step too close to a woman Marcus recognized. He'd hired a man named Kendricks 6 weeks after that photograph. Kendricks was former law enforcement, methodical, quiet, and had never once needed to be told something twice. Marcus had found him the same way he found most things that mattered, through a referral from someone who understood that some work required discretion the way good freight required proper handling. You didn't rush it. You didn't broadcast it. You got the cargo where it needed to go. He thought about the morning he'd met Simone outside a coffee shop on Trade Street 10 years earlier, her dropping a folder of architectural drawings and him catching two before they hit the pavement. She'd been working at a design firm then, sharp and focused, with a laugh that arrived without warning, and a habit of finishing other people's sentences that he'd found charming for longer than he probably should have. There had been a version of their life together that he had genuinely loved. He understood that clearly enough to grieve it honestly, which he did, in private, in the way men grieve things they do not perform for an audience. The dinner had been her idea. Simone had texted at 3 p.m, "Dinner tonight, Harvest Moon, 7 o'clock. Wear the gray jacket." He'd known, somewhere beneath the ordinary routine of the request, that the gray jacket meant she wanted him to look like someone worth the room. He understood now that she'd wanted him to look presentable for a conversation she'd already decided the shape of. She was already seated when he arrived. Champagne poured, untouched, red dress. Hair up. The particular expression of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say until it felt like resolution. He ordered water. She didn't comment. They had moved beyond the part of their marriage where she'd have noticed. She told him she was in love with Derek Hollis. She said it carefully, not cruelly. The way people deliver news they've convinced themselves is actually kindness. She told him Derek was the kind of man who had real vision, real ambition, who moved through the world like someone with something to say. She told him Marcus had spent 9 years managing freight routes and distribution centers and had never once talked about what came next, what was possible, what they were building toward together. The couple beside them had gone quiet. A waiter paused mid-pour somewhere behind her. Marcus didn't look at any of them. He looked at the envelope. He opened it. He read what needed reading. And then he picked up the pen she'd provided. A good one, he noticed. Weighted. The kind you choose when you want the signing to feel significant. And he signed every flagged page without a single question. His hand did not shake. It never had, not on job sites in winter, not when Cora May's diagnosis had come in that small examination room in Concord, not at the moment he'd closed the financing on the acquisition that had made him, on paper, one of the wealthier men in Mecklenburg County. It was not a hand that shook. It was a hand that worked. When he was done, he closed the envelope, set it back in front of her, and reached for his wallet. He laid his card on the table, flat, black, the kind of card that carries no logo, because it doesn't need one. The server returned from the machine with a different quality of posture. He held the card in both hands. "Mr. Avery," he said, with the precise tone of a man recalibrating everything he'd assumed about the table he was standing next to. "It's an honor, sir." Simone's smile slipped 1/4 of an inch and then corrected itself. She filed it away as someone angling for a tip. She had always been good at finding explanations that didn't require her to change what she already believed. Marcus stood. He buttoned the gray jacket she'd chosen for him. "Take care of yourself, Simone," he said, and left her there with the champagne and the candlelight and the folder of signed papers, and walked out of Harvest Moon onto Selwyn Avenue without a backward glance. His phone rang before he'd reached the truck. "Kendricks, you'll want to hear this tonight," Kendricks said. Message came through 40 minutes ago from Mrs. Avery's number to Mr. Hollis. You want me to read it? Go ahead, Marcus said. He signed everything. No pushback, no argument. Just like you said he would. He never fights for anything. Marcus sat in the truck for a moment. The October air moved through the cracked window. He thought about Derek Hollis, sitting in the Ballantyne mansion that showed up on Avery Meridian's asset ledger as a corporate residence, sleeping under a roof that Marcus's company paid the property taxes on, boarding a Gulfstream G450 that lived in Hangar 7 at Charlotte Douglas under a tail number registered to an Avery Meridian subsidiary, using all of it with the easy confidence of a man who had never once stopped to ask who actually owned the ground he walked on. She had no idea what she had actually started. He drove home through Myers Park with the window down. The house on Hawthorne Lane sat quiet in the October dark. He made fresh coffee, stood on the deck he'd built, and let the cold air settle around him the way it does when a season is changing, and there's no use arguing with it. Over the following 3 weeks, Kendricks's reports arrived in a sequence that filled in the architecture of what had been built behind Marcus's back, one structural detail at a time. Derek Hollis had been cultivating Simone for 7 months. It had begun at a regional logistics conference in Uptown, where she'd attended as Marcus's +1, and Derek had introduced himself with the particular energy of a man who'd learned to use borrowed credentials like a borrowed suit, well-fitted enough to fool you across the room. What Derek had told Simone about himself was a carefully edited version. The jet was his, he'd implied. The Ballantyne estate was his. The travel, the dinners, the world he'd shown her over 7 months, all framed as the life of a man of independent means who happened to have a senior role at a private logistics company for the challenge of it. Not because he needed the salary. What Derek had not told Simone was that the senior role paid him $214,000 a year, that Marcus had approved his most recent merit increase in February, and that the jet he'd been flying her on had been authorized for his use as a business travel perk, a perk whose continuation depended entirely on his continued employment. He had used his access to Avery Meridian's assets the way some men use borrowed confidence, as though possession were the same as ownership, and no one would ever think to check the deed. Kendricks found something else in the 3rd week. A series of messages between Derek and a contact at a competing freight firm in Greensboro. Derek had been running conversations about a potential move, not employment, but a data exchange. Client shipping routes, vendor rate agreements, proprietary infrastructure maps that Marcus's operations team had spent 3 years building. The kind of information that would have saved a competitor 2 years of development time and cost Avery Meridian clients it had spent a decade earning. Derek had been shopping it quietly, still sounding out terms. Not yet committed, but the conversation was real, and the intent was documented in his own words across 11 messages. Marcus read the file on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, with his coffee going cold beside him. There is a thing that happens when you see the full shape of a betrayal at once. When the separate facts arrange themselves into a pattern, you can finally read clearly. It is not rage, exactly. It is something colder and more useful than rage. It is the moment a logistics man stops asking how the cargo got damaged and starts planning the route that bypasses the problem entirely. His mother had told him once, stirring a pot of something on a November evening when he was 12 years old and furious about something he could no longer remember. Patience is not waiting, Marcus. Patience is working while the other person stops paying attention. He called a woman named Vera Chance on a Monday morning. Vera had been general counsel for Avery Meridian for 7 years. She had the kind of legal mind that found exits in rooms other lawyers thought were sealed, and she had the further quality of delivering hard information without drama. The way a good freight manifest delivers facts, complete, in order, without editorializing. He told her what he had. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Give me 72 hours. Don't move anything yet." He didn't. He drove to site visits that week. He approved payroll. He reviewed a rate proposal from a regional carrier in Tennessee. He did everything a man who managed freight routes did, because that was what the world still believed he was. He had spent his entire career understanding something most people never learn about logistics. The most important part of moving something valuable is making sure no one knows it's moving until it arrives. Vera came back on Thursday with a folder that had 4 tabbed sections. She walked him through each one across a conference table on the 31st floor of a building on South Tryon Street that Avery Meridian owned outright, though the signage in the lobby suggested otherwise. The first section covered the asset use violations, the jet, the property, the entertainment expenses Derek had run through his corporate card for evenings that bore no resemblance to business purpose. The second covered the data conversations in Greensboro, supported by screenshots Kendricks had obtained through means Vera described only as sufficient. The third was a valuation summary, Avery Meridian's exposure if the client data had transferred. The number was north of $4 million in projected contract losses. The fourth section was a single page, a termination notice, an asset recall authorization, and a civil recovery filing ready to execute. Vera set her pen down and looked at him across the table. "He used your wife to build credibility with a social circle he needed access to," she said. "He needed her on his arm at certain dinners. She made him look like a man with roots, not just access. Whether she knew she was being used that way, she let the sentence stop there. That's a different question." Marcus nodded. He thought about Simone at those dinners, the ones he'd attended himself and the ones Kendricks had photographed. She'd looked lighter in those photographs than she had at their own kitchen table in years. He was honest enough with himself to know that stung, and self-possessed enough to know that it didn't change anything about what he had to do next. He needed her in the room when it happened. He needed witnesses. He needed the full shape of what had been constructed behind his back to become visible all at once, to everyone who had been gathered to celebrate it. There was an annual freight and logistics summit held every October at the Westin on West Trade Street. A formal evening, invited guests, regional industry leaders, a catered dinner, presentations from senior staff. Derek Hollis was scheduled to present on behalf of Avery Meridian's Southeast Corridor expansion. Marcus had approved the agenda himself 3 months prior, before any of this had begun to surface. He had not yet unapproved it. 3 days passed. Marcus called Kendricks and asked him one question: "Is she attending with him?" Kendricks confirmed it within the hour. Simone was on the guest list, added by Derek as his companion, for a dinner being hosted by the company her husband had built and still ran from the quiet end of an organization chart she'd never thought to look at. He went home that evening and ate dinner at the kitchen table by himself. He turned on the television in the living room without watching it, the way you keep a light on in a house to make it look occupied. Then he went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept better than he had in weeks, because the difference between carrying a problem and having a plan for it is the difference between dead weight and loaded cargo. Real power operated in quiet rooms, and Marcus Avery had been in his longest quiet room for 9 years. He was almost done. The Westin Ballroom on West Trade Street had the kind of lighting that made everyone look a little more important than they were. Chandeliers on dimmers, white linen on every table. A stage at the far end with a screen showing a rotating slide of the summit's corporate sponsors. Avery Meridian's logo sat in the top left position, as it always did, as it had every year for 6 years running, because that was the position reserved for presenting companies. Marcus arrived through a side entrance at 7:45, 15 minutes after the reception cocktail hour had begun, with Vera Chance beside him and 2 members of his security team a half step behind. He'd worn the charcoal suit, same one he'd worn to site visits for years, clean and pressed, nothing announcing itself. The room was warm with the specific energy of people performing confidence at each other over drinks they were nursing carefully. Round tables, name cards, a podium up front where Derek Hollis was already working his way through a story that had a room full of regional freight executives chuckling. He stood at the head of the presenter's area in a navy suit that fit him well, a glass of something amber in one hand, the other gesturing at the slide behind him with the ease of a man who decided the room already belonged to him. Simone was seated at the front table. A green dress, hair down, a pair of earrings Marcus had never seen before. She was laughing at something the woman beside her said. The way she laughed when she felt genuinely comfortable somewhere, open, unheld. The laugh he remembered from Trade Street 10 years ago and had not heard aimed in his direction in longer than he wanted to calculate. She looked happy. He held that observation without comment, the way a man holds a measurement he hasn't decided what to build from yet. Derek spotted him first. The sentence he was in the middle of simply stopped. The glass in his hand went still. Marcus walked to the front of the room at a pace that was not hurried and was not slow. He stepped up beside the podium. He did not need the microphone, but he stood close enough to it that when he spoke, the sound carried to every table without effort. "Good evening," he said. "For those of you I haven't met in person, my name is Marcus Avery. I'm the founder and principal owner of Avery Meridian Holdings." The room resettled itself. A few people who hadn't known who he was exchanged glances. Several who did went very still. Derek set his glass down on the edge of the podium with a small, careful movement. The way you set something down when your hand has started to lose its reliability. "I want to thank all of you for being here this evening," Marcus continued. "And I want to be transparent about something that should have been made plain before tonight's presentation began." He looked at Derek. Not with heat, not with any visible feeling at all, with the clean, flat attention of a man reading a freight manifest. "Mr. Hollis serves as a senior logistics director at Avery Meridian. He does not own a position in this company. He does not own any of the assets associated with his role here. The aircraft, the company residence in Ballantyne, the corporate travel accounts, those belong to Avery Meridian, which means they belong to me." The room did not make a sound. Derek's jaw moved once, like a man testing whether language was still available to him, and then it stopped. Simone's head had turned toward Marcus the moment he said his name. She was watching him now with an expression he had never seen on her face in 9 years of marriage. Not anger, not grief, not the practiced composure she wore at social gatherings. Something that had not yet decided what it was. 3 weeks ago, Marcus said, "My wife and I signed divorce papers at a restaurant on Selwyn Avenue. She told me she was leaving for a man with vision, a man with a private jet and a beautiful home." He paused. She was not incorrect about any of those things. She simply did not know who owned them. He nodded to Vera, who stepped forward and placed a folder on the presenter's table. "Mr. Hollis has also been in conversation with a competitor firm regarding proprietary client and infrastructure data belonging to Avery Meridian. Those conversations are documented. The civil recovery process begins tomorrow morning." Vera did not look up from the folder as she said it. She opened it to the first tab and slid a single page across the table face up. This is Mr. Hollis's termination of employment, effective tonight. This, she turned to the second tab, is the formal asset recall notice covering the Ballantyne property and the G450. Both are to be vacated within 72 hours. The silence in that room had a weight to it. Not the silence of shock, exactly, more the silence of a large group of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about the last 2 hours. Derek's hand found the back of a chair. He gripped it with the particular grip of a man who needs something solid between himself and the ground. "I didn't," he started. His voice came out lower than he likely intended. "Marcus, I can explain you spent 7 months using my wife as a social credential," Marcus said. "You put her on your arm at industry dinners to make yourself look like a man of substance to people who would otherwise have looked harder at your actual standing. You used a jet that she believed was yours, a house she believed was yours. You told her you were something you are not, and you used the access you had through this company to do it." He let that sit for exactly 1 breath. "I'm not angry, Derek. I want you to hear that clearly. Anger would suggest this surprised me. It didn't." He turned to Simone then. She had not moved. Her hands were flat on the white tablecloth in front of her, and her face had the look of a woman watching the architecture of the last 7 months disassemble itself beam by beam. "Simone," he said. His voice did not change its register. "You told me I never had vision, that I spent 9 years managing freight routes and never talked about what came next. I want you to understand something, and I want you to understand it here, in this room, with people who can confirm it." He reached into his jacket and removed a single folded document. He set it on the table in front of her, without drama. "That's the operating summary for Avery Meridian as of last quarter. 11 regional distribution hubs, 412 employees, contracts in 7 states. I built this while you were deciding I had nothing to show for myself." She looked at the document. Then she looked at him. Whatever she had been about to say did not arrive. "The man you chose," Marcus said, "was using you. He needed you to perform a version of his life that the assets he had access to could not perform on their own. He dressed you up and brought you to rooms full of people he was trying to impress, and he let you believe you were the reason he belonged there. You were the credential, Simone, not the partner." Something moved through her face then. Not tears, not yet, but the thing that comes before them when a woman of genuine pride understands, fully and finally, that she has been made a prop in someone else's performance. Her eyes went to Derek. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Vera's folder with the expression of a man reading his own sentence. "Enzo," she started, then stopped, catching herself. Her hand came up to her mouth. Wrong name. She had confused the men she'd trusted with the men she'd been given. "Derek," she said. "Say something. Tell him it isn't. Tell him what you told me." Derek did not tell her anything. He was very quiet in the way men go quiet when there is nothing left to negotiate with. One of the regional executives near the back of the room stood, collected his jacket from his chair, and walked toward the exit without addressing anyone. 2 others followed within 30 seconds. The room was bleeding guests the way a poorly loaded truck bleeds cargo on a bad road. Slowly at first, then all at once. Vera closed the folder. Her part of the evening was finished. Simone stood up from the table. Her legs were steady, which Marcus noted because it told him something true about her. Whatever she was not frail, and he had never wanted to see her frail. She crossed the distance between them with her chin level and her hands at her sides, and she looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has arrived somewhere she didn't know she was traveling toward. "I didn't know," she said, "about any of it. The company. The jet. I didn't know, Marcus. "I believe that," he said. And he did. It didn't change the shape of the 9 months behind them or the signed papers between them. But it was true, and he'd always thought the truth deserved its own acknowledgement, regardless of what it couldn't undo. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. Her voice was quiet now, sanded down to something raw. "All these years, why did you let me think? Because I built it for us," he said. "Not for dinner party conversation. Not so you'd look at me differently at a fundraiser. I built it because that's what I do. I find a problem in the infrastructure, and I solve it, and I keep solving it until the thing holds weight." He paused. "I thought that was enough. I was wrong about that, and I've had time to sit with being wrong about it." She had no answer. Her mouth pressed together, and she looked away briefly, out across the half-emptied room, at the slide still rotating on the screen behind the podium, Avery Meridian's logo at the top left, patient and unmoving. "Take care of yourself, Simone," he said. He buttoned his jacket. He nodded to Vera. He walked toward the side exit through which he'd arrived, and he did not look back across that room, because he had already seen everything in it that he needed to see. There is a kind of closure that does not feel like triumph and does not feel like peace. Not yet. It feels like the last nail driven into a frame. The moment when the structure is finally sound, and you can step back and know it will hold without you standing there watching it. He drove home on surface streets, past the freight yards off Brookshire Freeway where he'd spent 3 winters on overnight dispatch shifts before anyone knew his name. The same yards that fed 11 hubs now in 7 states, moving cargo through infrastructure he'd built from memory of those cold overnight shifts when nobody was watching, and he worked anyway. He parked in the driveway on Hawthorne Lane and sat for a moment under the porch light. His own front steps, poured and finished by his own hands, still holding. 14 months passed. Charlotte in December has a particular quality of light, low and pale, settling across the Piedmont like something that has come a long way and is finally resting. Marcus had put a woodworking shop together in the detached garage behind the house on Hawthorne Lane, something he'd been planning to do for 3 years, and it simply made the time for once the house was his alone. He was finishing the frame of a sideboard cabinet on a Saturday morning, the garage warm with sawdust and the smell of cedar oil. The house had a different feel than it used to, more itself. He'd refinished the deck boards in September. He had a woman in his life, carefully and unhurriedly, a structural engineer named Pauline, who had come to a Meridian vendor meeting in the spring and had stayed because she asked good questions and never required him to explain why he worked the way he worked. She wasn't the center of this chapter. She was the thing that reminded him the next one existed. Avery Meridian had expanded to a 12th hub in the fall, this one outside Knoxville. Derek Hollis had been terminated the night of the Weston Summit. The civil recovery judgment came to $640,000. He settled for what he had and relocated to Greensboro, working a regional sales role at a packaging company for considerably less than Avery Meridian had paid him. The mansion in Ballantyne was vacated inside 72 hours and was now leased to a family from Ohio. The G450 had been sold in January. Kendricks's final report was 3 paragraphs long. Marcus read it once and filed it. Simone had moved into a South End apartment and returned to design work, the kind she'd always been good at, the kind she'd set aside somewhere in the middle years of their marriage. Marcus heard this from Earl, who heard it from Leona, Simone's aunt, who still called Marcus once a month because she'd decided years ago that her loyalty was to the man who showed up and did the quiet work. He wished Simone nothing cruel. He'd made his peace long before the Weston, which was why the evening had cost him so little and settled so cleanly afterward. He set down the sanding block and looked at the cabinet frame in the morning light. The joints were clean. The proportions were right. Cora May had told him once, watching him fix a fence post when he was 14, that a man who builds something solid is never actually standing still. He's just moving in a direction most people don't think to look. He thought about freight, the way he always did when something settled into its right place, all of it moving at once. Through 11 hubs, through 7 states, through infrastructure that had no single face and needed none. Moving without announcement, arriving where it was supposed to arrive. She had left him for the jet and the mansion and the story of a man whose life looked like something. She had no idea that the man she'd spent 9 years looking past had been the author of everything she thought she was running toward. Some things don't need to be said aloud to be true. The frame of the cabinet was square. The joints were tight. The December light lay across the garage floor with the patience of something that has always known it would eventually reach the window. He picked up the sanding block and went back to work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.